The corridors of the Kremlin carried a rare sense of anticipation, the kind that emerges only when diplomatic currents shift in ways that could redefine the geopolitical map. On a cold December afternoon in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed two of Washington's most influential envoys, Steve Witkoff, the U.S. special negotiator tasked by President Donald Trump, and Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner. Their arrival marked the latest attempt to break the deadlock in the war that has reshaped Europe, strained the global economy, and tested alliances from Brussels to Beijing. The talks were held behind closed doors in a long, ornate conference room deep inside the Kremlin compound. On one side of the table sat Putin, flanked by senior Russian figures, including Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov and Moscow's lead negotiator Kirill Dmitriev. Directly across, Witkoff and Kushner listened carefully, aware that their presence signaled a diplomatic opening that many doubted could ever materialize. Washington had sent them to deliver a revised version of the U.S. peace plan, one significantly altered after Kyiv and several European governments objected to what they considered excessive concessions to Moscow. Yet the Kremlin made clear even before the meeting began that it saw Europe, not the United States, as the primary obstacle to ending the war. Just hours earlier, Putin had sharpened his rhetoric toward European leaders who, he argued, were deliberately blocking a negotiated settlement. He insisted that Moscow remained open to diplomacy, but warned that Russia was fully prepared for any escalation. In a blunt message aimed squarely at European capitals, he declared, "We have no intention of going to war with Europe. I have said this 100 times, but if Europe wants to and starts, we are ready." There can be no doubt about that. It was a remark that reverberated quickly across the continent, underscoring the tension surrounding the Washington-Moscow channel that had begun to re-emerge under the Trump administration. Inside the Kremlin meeting room, Witkoff laid out the framework of Washington's proposal, a redesigned formula aimed at freezing hostilities while establishing a pathway toward eventual territorial negotiations. U.S. officials argue that the new plan offers stronger security guarantees for Ukraine than earlier drafts, though details have not been made public. According to American diplomats, the latest version reflects weeks of consultations with NATO allies, but even so, concerns remain that Washington might be moving ahead faster than Europe is prepared to accept. For Kyiv, the timing of this meeting was crucial. Ukrainian officials told reporters earlier in the day that they expected to meet Witkoff and Kushner within 24 hours, possibly in Brussels. That round of talks would allow Ukraine to weigh the revised U.S. plan before it advances any further. Kyiv's leadership has repeatedly warned that any agreement drafted without full Ukrainian participation risks unraveling, especially if it appears to pressure Ukraine into territorial concessions. Putin, however, suggested that Kyiv had no real interest in peace. Speaking with growing frustration during a separate session that same afternoon, he argued that the Ukrainian government and its European supporters viewed diplomacy as a threat, not a solution. In his words, they don't have a peace agenda, they are on the side of war. Even when they try, apparently, to make some changes to Trump's proposals, and we see that clearly. All these changes have only one objective: to completely block this entire peace process. It was a striking accusation from a leader who also asserted that Ukraine was being encouraged by the West to prolong the conflict at any cost. To underscore his point, Putin repeated his earlier warning about Europe pushing the conflict into new and dangerous territory. In remarks directed at Western defense ministers, he emphasized, "If Europe suddenly starts a war against us, I think it will all be over quickly. This isn't Ukraine. With Ukraine, we are acting surgically, carefully and precisely." The line reflected a widening gap between how Russia portrays its operations and how the rest of the world views the war's impact, which includes tens of thousands of casualties, millions displaced, and vast swaths of Ukrainian infrastructure destroyed. As the meeting continued in Moscow, the atmosphere was one of both caution and inevitability. Witkoff and Kushner did not travel to the Kremlin to negotiate directly. They came to deliver a message and a document. But the symbolism mattered. This was the highest-level U.S. visit to Moscow since Trump returned to office, and the Kremlin was eager to convey that Washington had finally acknowledged Russia's central role in any future settlement. For Putin, hosting the envoys sent a clear message. He was ready to be seen as a statesman capable of ending the conflict, provided his conditions were not dismissed outright. Jared Kushner, who has taken on an increasingly visible diplomatic role within the Trump White House, listened more than he spoke. People familiar with the meeting said, but his presence alone highlighted a key feature of the Trump administration's foreign policy style, an emphasis on personal relationships and informal networks over traditional diplomatic channels. In Moscow, that approach appeared to resonate. The Kremlin views Kushner as a direct line to the U.S. president, someone who can bypass bureaucratic debates in Washington. Outside the Kremlin walls, meanwhile, the diplomatic theatre extended onto the streets of Moscow. Cameras captured Witkoff and Kushner walking across Red Square later that evening, accompanied by Kirill Dmitriev, one of Putin's closest economic advisors and a central figure in earlier back-channel contacts between Moscow and Washington. Their presence on the cobblestones of one of the world's most symbolic public squares added a layer of spectacle to a day already rich with geopolitical significance. Back inside Washington and Brussels, reaction to the meeting ranged from cautious optimism to outright suspicion. European Union officials expressed unease that a major diplomatic channel had opened without their participation. Several diplomats privately warned that the United States risked repeating historical mistakes, especially the perception of trying to negotiate Europe's security architecture without Europe fully present at the table. In Kyiv, the concern was even more stark. Ukrainian leaders fear that Washington's willingness to engage directly with Moscow could lead to pressure on Ukraine to accept a ceasefire that freezes Russian territorial gains. Publicly, Ukrainian officials thanked the United States for its efforts but insisted that any agreement must safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty. Still, the Trump administration appears determined to push forward. Officials close to the negotiations say the president views ending the war as a priority one that he believes could reshape his global legacy. Trump has repeatedly argued that the conflict can be resolved quickly if both sides are willing to make concessions, though his critics warn that such an approach risks legitimizing Russian control over occupied territories. For Putin, the stakes are equally high. The war has become a defining test of his leadership, shaping Russia's economy, military posture, and relationship with the West. Though he insists Russia is acting surgically in Ukraine, the conflict has dragged on far longer than the Kremlin initially anticipated. A negotiated settlement that preserves Russian influence without appearing to capitulate could offer the political victory he seeks. As the day drew to a close, officials familiar with the talks described the meeting as constructive, but emphasized that no final decisions were made. What emerged instead was a clearer understanding of the challenges ahead. The United States presented its revised plan. Russia laid out its red lines, Europe made its objections known from afar, and Ukraine prepared for its own round of discussions with the American envoys. In many ways, the diplomacy unfolding this week reflects the broader reality of the war itself, a conflict shaped as much by global politics as by battlefield dynamics. Every negotiation is influenced by the same fundamental question: what does a sustainable peace look like, and who gets to define it? In Moscow, Putin insists that Europe is the problem, not the solution. In Washington, Trump's advisors argue that a deal is within reach if all sides show flexibility. In Kyiv, leaders maintain that no peace can come at the price of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And in European capitals, governments fear being sidelined entirely. The meeting at the Kremlin did not end the war. It did not resolve the territorial disputes or security guarantees that continue to divide the parties. Yet it marked an undeniable turning point, one that signaled a shift in the diplomatic landscape and a renewed willingness, at least in Washington and Moscow, to explore a political exit from a conflict that has devastated a nation and unsettled an entire continent. Whether the process moves forward or collapses under competing interests will depend on the decisions made in the coming days. For now, What remains clear is that the political maneuvering around this war is entering a new phase one, defined by direct engagement, high-stakes diplomacy, and the recognition that the world can no longer afford endless stalemate.